Journalist Laksha Jain released a new poll which finds that support for trans rights has fallen pretty significantly, unfortunately. As he put it, it's possibly the worst issue for progressives he's ever polled. And in his article, he details how even though the Democratic Party's approval has bounced back, support for trans rights has only declined. The poll finds that a majority of voters still support discrimination against trans people in school sports. They also oppose life-saving, medically necessary gender-affirming healthcare for trans youth. And a majority now even supports unconstitutional restrictions on their bathroom usage. And while support for same-sex marriage still remains pretty high, a plurality of Americans now side with Republicans overall on LGBTQ+ issues, presumably because they approve of the party's explicit transphobia. And Jane concludes the backsliding is real and serious. This is perhaps the most unfavorable that the public has been towards trans rights in quite some time. Republicans have successfully and effectively exploited several flashpoint issues like sports in order to shift public opinion in their direction, while progressives have been unable to effectively muster persuasive arguments. Some of this may be down to an unwillingness to even entertain a debate in an unsuccessful effort to maintain a unified front. Progressive activists and organizations have often been confrontational when challenged with dissenting views, leading critics to claim that these tactics left little room for actual debate. The net result, however, is the worst-case scenario for progressives and trans individuals alike, as a previously sympathetic public support of trans rights has completely unraveled over the last decade. And on Twitter, Jane recommends that progressives address this by watering down their support for trans rights by ceding ground on issues like sports. And he also argues that he doesn't think this trend is going to change unless, quote, there's a change in tactics from the movement. Now, we're going to address that recommendation in a minute, but first, I want to look at the conclusions being drawn from this poll, both from liberals and fascists, because needless to say, I think that they're downright dangerous. And Sahil Kapoor said something that I see a lot of liberals saying, that this is evidence that the Democratic Party should indeed abandon trans people. He says there's a vocal segment of liberals and lefties who turned against Gavin Newsom when he made those comments, but polls keep showing even Democratic voters are skeptical of trans athletes in women's sports. Newsom wasn't breaking with his base, he was aligning with it. He adds, as anyone who lived through the 2020 primary will know, most passionate voices online do not equal party base. Now, on the opposite side of the spectrum, self-proclaimed theocratic fascist Matt Walsh declared victory minutes after the poll was published, writing on Twitter, "Everything I've said about transgenderism for the past 10 years has been absolutely correct and totally vindicated. Now I'm telling you that the trans violence we've seen so far is nothing compared to what's coming if we don't treat trans ideology as a severe public safety hazard and crack down on it immediately and aggressively." And that tweet right there speaks to how anti-trans rhetoric has reached Nazi levels. It's not just that trans people are bathroom predators. Now they're apparently violent threats who pose public safety hazards too. So the anti-trans rhetoric obviously is escalating, and those two tweets really encapsulate how this poll is being used as a justification to abandon trans people at a minimum or crack down on them at worst. Now, I'm not blaming Jane, to be clear. He just conducted and released the poll, so I'm not going to shoot the messenger. But with that being said, I don't think that his framing helped. And I also take issue with the wording of some of the questions in this poll. For example, there was one question that tries to gauge support by asking whether or not they support prohibiting, quote, the teaching of gender identity in public elementary schools, but I don't really know what that means, and I'm sure the respondents who took this poll don't either. Does that mean, teaching general acceptance or queer history? Who knows? But I think that Americans might view that as code for, oh, should schools turn my kids trans? Because that's what Republicans have told them that they're doing. The poll also asks whether or not Americans support gender surgery for minors, but again, there's no context here. Americans are going to hear that and think, oh, that means chopping off kids' dicks, when that's not a thing that's actually happening, contrary to popular belief. It's like asking if you support gay people punching straight people in the face. Like, I'm obviously against that, but is that really a phenomenon that's prevalent enough to warrant a public opinion poll? Especially because after the image of gay people punching straight people in the faces has been planted into my head, I might not be too kind to gay people in subsequent questions. But I'm not trying to nitpick the wording or methodology of this poll, because unfortunately, this poll is in line with other polls who found that, yes, trans people are not very popular right now. But my real issue is with Jane's framing of the findings and the conclusions that he draws, because I think that he is saying things that are harmful. He provides zero evidence to suggest that radical trans activists are the ones who turned the country against trans people. And on top of that, he doesn't mention the millions of dollars being spent by Republicans against trans people. But I just want to say here, as somebody who probably falls into that category that, he would characterize as a radical trans activist, the left will cede ground to bigots over my dead body, because while I don't deny that public opinion on trans rights is obviously negative, the same can be said for literally every other civil rights issue throughout our country's entire fucking history. If marginalized people waited until public opinion changed to ask for rights, we would never make any progress on any issue ever. So quite frankly, I don't give a fuck if Americans agree or disagree with trans rights. If a new poll came out tomorrow showing that 99.9% of Americans oppose all rights for trans people, guess what? I'd still stand 10 toes down with the trans community, because civil rights are non-negotiable. And I don't care about what's popular. I care about what's right. We're talking about basic human rights that don't get to be vetoed by a tyrannical majority that's been brainwashed by a fascist right-wing movement. But based on Jane's analysis, I think that he'd probably argue that my refusal to back down or even debate the issue is why public opinion has shifted so sharply against trans people. But I can assure him that that is not the case. Americans aren't listening to the Humanist report. They're not listening to activists on Twitter and concluding, wow, I used to support trans people, but after seeing how unreasonable these trans activists are, I think they've gone too far and I'm withdrawing my support. That's not happening. Like, the average person isn't Cenk Uygur or Anna Kasparian. Most people aren't privy to these super insular debates that are occurring online. The reason why support for trans people has slipped is because Americans have been bombarded with nonstop anti-trans propaganda for nearly 4 years. Republicans have poured millions of dollars into a fear-mongering campaign about just a small minority of people, all so they can divide the working class, so that way they're not paying attention to the Epstein class robbing the rest of them blind. Republicans know that trans people don't pose a threat to society. It's society that actually poses a threat to them, but they target trans people because they're an easy scapegoat. Since most Americans, they don't have a reference point. They don't know a trans person. So it's easy to exploit their ignorance and fill their heads with untrue bullshit if they don't have anything else to go on. The same was true about gay people. They were cultural pariahs. They were seen as diseased, literally, and they were seen as predatory perverts because politicians and propagandists told people that they were diseased, predatory perverts. It took decades upon decades of gay people coming out one by one for the rest of the public to finally realize, oh, okay, those things that I was told about gay people weren't true, because now I know a gay person. My son or my sister is gay. Therefore, the propaganda that was once embedded in their brains begins to break down, because the people that they said were monsters obviously aren't monsters if you know them, and they're perfectly pleasant people. Now, in the 2010s, trans people started to really come out in larger numbers and finally get representation in mass media for the first time, but conservatives decided to push back against that seemingly inevitable cultural shift because they didn't want trans rights to become another losing battle for them like gay rights was. They saw how culture and mass media helped to foster widespread acceptance for gays and lesbians, and they responded by saying, you know what, we're going to hijack this new movement, because if people start to see trans people as human beings, then we're going to lose that battle too. Like, that's why they're targeting Bud Light, because seeing a trans woman's face on a beer can, something as simple as that, might help to normalize their existence. It's why they're propping up losers like Riley Gaines, who tied for 5th place with the trans woman, because they know that Americans are going to see that pretty white woman and be more likely to empathize with her than nameless, faceless trans people that they've never met. And one thing Republicans get, though, that nobody else seems to understand, is that public opinion is not static. I genuinely believe that you could convince Americans to cut off their own dicks if you fed them a consistent diet of propaganda for 4 years. Republicans know that they can make their position the default position if they're persistent enough, if they say it over and over and over again. It's why everyone thought that Biden had open borders while he was literally deporting millions and millions of immigrants, because that's all that people heard. So they didn't have a reason to question what they were hearing, since nobody was challenging that false claim. It's why Americans have long viewed the Republican Party, the party of trickle trickle down as the party that's better on the economy. Because propaganda is very effective, but it's especially powerful when Democrats don't even try to offer a counter narrative. So of course, trans bad is going to become the default position to average Americans because that's what they're hearing and they don't have anything else to go on. So they're just like, okay, yeah, fuck trans people. Most Democrats, they sat by for years and they said nothing, even as right-wing rhetoric towards trans people became downright genocidal. And to add insult to injury, some Democrats who refuse to challenge these harmful narratives are now trying to ride the waves of hate created by Republican propaganda, all to further their own political careers. Case in point, Kamala Harris recently came out in favor of discrimination towards trans people in sports after Republicans hammered her over trans issues during the election. It didn't matter to them that she didn't even mention trans people once in her policy platform. That wasn't enough. She thinks that she needs to be explicitly anti-trans to be electorally viable these days. But she's not alone because multiple 2028 contenders have either come out in support of discrimination against trans people or they've tried to muddy the waters about trans rights. Here's some examples.
I have 2 little girls. I don't want them getting run over on a playing field by a male or formerly male athlete. But as a Democrat, I'm supposed to be afraid to say that.
The backlash I've received for even raising the issue proves my point, that we have trouble as a party just simply having discussions about these complicated issues.
You right now should come out and be like, you know what? The young man who's about to win the state championship in the long jump in female sports,
right.
that shouldn't happen. You as the governor should step out and say no.
No, and I appreciate.
But like, would you do something like that? Would you say no men in female sports?
Well, I think it's an issue of fairness. I completely agree with you on that. For removing the humanity, right versus wrong, the morality on either side, politically, it is a major problem for the Democratic Party.
What about for your values? I mean, is 8 years old too young?
Yeah, I mean, look, I now that I have a 9-year-old, just became 9. Come on, man. I get it. So those are legit. Mm-hmm. The trans issue for me is also novel. It's over the last few years. I'm trying to understand as much as anyone else. Whole pronoun thing. Trying to understand all of that. Well, that was like the hell. I mean, all that stuff. I get it. And this notion of gender affirming care for children, that's tough, man. And in the science on that, I haven't dove that deep into it, but I read one report and then there's one that's slightly contradictory. And then they said, there's no contradictory. Here's what the UK just came out with. You're full of shit. It's absolutely scientifically sound that it's outrageous, and so it's intense. And then I meet with families, literally meet with families, save my child's life, and they're thriving.
You can't serve the country until you're 18. You can't buy a gun. You can't get alcohol until you're 21. And I mean, to make that big of a decision as a kid, I mean, you could also be destroying a lot of lives as well. I mean, their brain isn't even fully developed.
You got, until 26 plus. Yeah. So that's even further with the brain. I come to this very much more open-minded than I've ever been. Mm-hmm. More receptive.
Should we be putting men in female prisons? Men claiming they're women?
No.
And, all right, here's my last one for you. Can a man become a woman?
Can a man become a woman? No.
Well, I think the approach starts with compassion. Compassion for transgender people. Compassion for families, especially of young people who are going through this. And also empathy for people who are not sure what all of this means for them, like wondering, wait a minute, I got a daughter in a sports league. Is she going to be competing with boys right now? Right, and just taking everybody seriously. Mm-hmm. And I think when you do that, that does call into question some of the past orthodoxies in my party, for example, around sports, mm-hmm. where I think most reasonable people would recognize that there are serious fairness issues if you just treat this as not mattering when a trans athlete wants to compete in women's sports.
Meaning the parent who's complained about this has a case, in your opinion?
Sure.
Gee, I just can't quite figure out why support for trans rights is starting to decline so sharply. When people see that the party that ostensibly supports trans people isn't even sure anymore, I mean, they're going to just assume, yeah, maybe there is some merit to all of the right-wing concerns that I'm hearing about. Ask yourself this. When Medicare for All had majority support during the 2019 primary, did you see any Republicans hedge on privatized healthcare and say, you know what, maybe progressives have a point and socialized medicine might be the best way to go? Of course not. They doubled down on their opposition to it. Do you think that Trump was spooked even a little bit when he saw polls for his tariffs and big bullshit bill? A Pew Research poll found that a majority opposed his tariffs and a plurality opposed the tax cuts that he gave to rich people that were included in the big bullshit bill. But do you remember him running away from that? Of course you don't, because he passed that shit. It doesn't matter how unpopular the policy that they're proposing is. Republicans always make the case for their side and they stick to their fucking guns. Whereas Democrats back down the second they sense even the slightest modicum of opposition to a policy they say they support. They never ever make the fucking case, and that is why Republicans are so dominant. Oh, Republicans are accusing us of having open borders and being too kind to immigrants. Actually, we hate immigrants too. And we even worked with a Republican to craft a border bill that's really bad. Oh, what's that? Republicans say that, we're trans extremists? Don't you worry. We'll chuck trans people right under the bus like we do to all other marginalized groups when it's politically convenient. It is so frustrating. And it's not just the propaganda that explains the backslide in support for trans rights. It's the complete and utter bitchification of the bitch-ass Democratic Party who couldn't shape a national agenda if their lives depended on it. And what makes this so infuriating to me is that when it comes to trans rights, the truth is actually on our side. For example, go back to that clip with Pete Buttigieg where he conceded to a parent that hypothetically was against the trans athlete at his kid's school. Like, something tells me he wouldn't say the same about a homophobic parent in the 90s who didn't want their kid playing sports with gay predators, because locker rooms, that could be where the predators prey. But his hypocrisy aside, they do not have a fucking case, and it was outrageous that he conceded that point. You just have to take the time to explain why they're wrong and make the case. And you also have to recalibrate the conversation so we're dealing with reality and not operating within the confines of right-wing lunacy. So instead of throwing trans athletes under a bus, if I were Pete Buttigieg, I would say, you know what? Trans athletes aren't a threat to your children, contrary to popular belief. One, because studies that aren't funded by right-wing think tanks show that trans athletes actually don't have physical advantages over cis athletes, assuming that they've undergone hormone replacement therapy. And two, you wouldn't even have to worry about it if that wasn't the case, because there's less than 100 trans athletes at the collegiate level in the entire country. So no, they're not destroying women's sports. And at the K through 12 level, the number is even lower. How low? Well, there's just 5 known trans athletes across the entire country at the K through 12 level. 5. And no, suffice it to say, I don't think that 5 athletes are destroying sports for your daughters. Quite the contrary, actually. In fact, one of those 5 athletes was 13-year-old Fisher Wells, the only known trans athlete in the entire state of Kentucky, whose 7th grade hockey team wouldn't even exist without her, seeing as how she recruited enough girls to even be able to form a hockey team. And even though her friends very clearly enjoyed playing with her, it was fun for them, they got together after school, they hung out. Well, do you want to know what Kentucky's lawmakers chose to do? They banned her from the team she helped create. It didn't matter that she went to the legislature in her state and pleaded with them and said, hey, my friends want me to play with them. They still passed a bill banning all future trans athletes, including Fisher Wells, from playing in school sports just to stop that one 13-year-old from having fun with their friends. So no, I don't think that parents who are drunk on Fox News Kool-Aid have legitimate concerns about trans athletes. And even if all 5 of the trans athletes were menaces and they were cracking the skulls of their cis teammates, it is still not a legitimate concern, statistically speaking, because your kid is more likely to be struck by lightning or eaten by a shark or murdered by a school shooter than they are to even encounter a trans athlete. Like, encountering a trans person, generally speaking, statistically, very unlikely in school. But a trans athlete, they are a minority of a minority. We're talking about a fraction of a percent here. So if you're concerned about trans athletes, congratulations, you've been duped. You've been distracted by the Epstein class who want you to think that trans people are the cause of all of your problems, even though it's the elites who are the ones that are robbing you blind. You simply have to make the fucking case that I'm making. Is that so difficult? But let's assume that Jane and the likes of Cenk Uygur and others who agree are correct, and that if we did concede on some issues, sports, for example, conservatives will finally leave trans people alone. Do we really think that this is the case? Really? I'm old enough to remember a time when conservatives only wanted to ban gender-affirming care for adolescents. Now, they've been pretty open about the fact that they don't think that anybody should have access to gender-affirming healthcare, even adults as well. So this is why you don't concede on anything ever, because once you give them an inch, they're going to take a mile. Or in this case, once you buy into the idea that some discrimination towards trans people on narrow issues is okay, you feed into the right's dehumanization of them and fan the flames of hate, because if some dehumanization is okay, why not a little more dehumanization on this issue and that issue? It's not like we're killing them, so as long as we, just nibble around the edges until there's no rights left, that's fine, right? Like, this is how you get fascist creep, which is why you hold strong and you reject the premise altogether and you insist that trans people, like all human beings, should be equal. Trans people should have the same rights as their cis peers, full stop. But even if you try to make the case and you fail, guess what? Trans issues aren't as salient to cis voters as other issues like the economy are. So they're not going to be motivated to vote against Democrats if they come off as too compassionate to trans people. But people with trans friends and family and trans people are going to be pissed off if Democrats choose to abandon them. But Jane will have to forgive me if I come off as one of these unreasonable trans rights activists who refuses to even hear the other side, because I see how this debate about trans people affects my trans family members. So I refuse to let people talk casually about this as if we're merely discussing tax policy when people's lives are at stake. Literally, as journalist Aaron Reed reports, suicides among trans teens skyrocketed in the UK following crackdowns on life-saving, medically necessary gender-affirming healthcare. And here at home, Republicans have already proposed more than 400 anti-LGBTQ plus bills in legislatures across the country, most of them anti-trans, and let me remind you, it's just February. And as high as that number is, it was actually higher last year. And the political and social climate towards trans people has gotten so toxic that genocide experts at the Lemkin Institute are now sounding the alarm about how we're in the early to mid stages of an actual trans genocide in the United States, with Lemkin's Institute president Dr. Alyssa von Hoden-Forhay warning that Republicans are using trans people to generate fear, particularly surrounding children, family, and their ideal concept of masculinity, to prime their base for genocide. But she's not alone. Dr. Gregory Stanton, president of the group Genocide Watch, agreed, saying that Donald Trump's executive order denying any recognition of any gender outside of the male-female binary is a totalitarian idea that is driven by Nazi ideology. Dr. Stanton also noted that such strict male-female binaries neither exist in nature nor in many other cultures. Quote, the Trump administration and its basis have identified a set of enemies or objectionable people and have stirred up public prejudice against them in a way that is escalating towards violence, said Dr. Henry Thuralt, who served as the International Association of Genocide Scholars from 2017 to 2021. Thuralt said the U.S. would increase policies to make life intolerable for trans Americans, something that will cause trans suicide rates to rise dramatically. And he adds, we're already at the point for trans folks, for immigrants, where the damage is being done, Dr. Thuralt said. So it's not so much will genocide happen as we got to stop it from happening. And on that note, it's gotten so bad that 48% of trans Americans have either moved from the state that they were living in due to crackdowns on trans rights, or they fled the country altogether. In fact, some of them ended up in a refugee camp in the Netherlands while they wait for their asylum claims to be processed. And I don't want to just breeze by that horrifying fact, so I'm going to say it again because it's important. There are American refugees who were forced to flee the country so they can escape political persecution. Let that sink in. That's what it's come to. But the radical trans activists are the ones who are expected to tone down their advocacy so as to not offend the fickle American public who's soured on trans rights because, according to Jane, we've been a little bit too vocal. Fuck that. We should be louder and more persistent than ever when it comes to trans rights, because I don't view this as some sort of popularity contest. I don't view this as a political game to be played. I view this as a fight for a group of people whose existence is existentially threatened by fascists. So no, Democrats shouldn't use Jane's poll as a justification to abandon trans people. They should see it as a failure and be ashamed by what has happened. It is the culmination of years of propaganda and millions of dollars being spent, and they didn't push back. So the takeaway from this poll, if you're an elected Democrat, should be, I need to fight even harder because things have gotten bad since I've withdrawn from the fight. I've ceded ground to the fascists. Because, I mean, if you can't even stand by the basic social justice principles that you purported to have just a couple of years ago, really, what good are you as a party? Like, why would you even exist at that point if you're not willing to do the bare fucking minimum for your own constituents? So I dare Democrats, try to pull a TYT. Just try and see what happens if you jump on the anti-trans bandwagon to make yourself more popular. TYT found out the hard way that actually didn't help them, because actually, if you purport to be progressive, you should stand for progressive values, and that means standing for marginalized people when they need you. So just try it. Like, if you want to come for my trans family and my trans friends, you're going to have to go through me and millions of other cis people who are not going to let you harm our trans family, right? And if there's anything we learned from Republicans, it's that bullying works. So I promise you, there will be fucking hell to pay for any Democrat who gets out of line on this issue. You either toe the line or you face our wrath. And let this be a warning to all Democrats thinking that they're going to run for president in 2028. Fuck around and find out. We will crush your 2028 ambitions the second you fucking equivocate. I am done with the spinelessness of this party. Either stand for what you say you believe in or fuck off.
Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Play stupid games.
F around and find out.
Play stupid games, win stupid prizes.
Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Play stupid game. Pride. Trans rights are human rights. It is necessary to push trans on the kids. Pride.